This is the Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. You can join our conversation about the week's news at WNPR.org/The Wheelhouse. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. I'm here bright and early with Colin McEnroe, the host of WNPR's Colin McEnroe Show. We were up late last night covering primary elections, so good to see you once again so soon, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Also with us is Kevin Rennie. He's an attorney. He's a Hartford Current columnist, and he also blogs at dailyructions.com. Hello there, Kevin.
Good morning.
And with us from our New Haven studios at Gateway Community College is Kalila Brown-Dean, Associate Professor of Political Science at Quinnipiac University. Hello there once again, Kalila.
Good morning.
So there's a lot to talk about from the primaries last night, but I suppose we should start with the most surprising upset of the night. Maybe not that surprising to people who've been following that race very closely, but maybe the margin of victory, the early date at which we found out what happened. Justin Elicker beating Toni Harp. Let's first of all listen to what these two candidates had to say afterward.
When you look at the results around the city, we have a clear mandate for New Haven to be a government that is ethical, that is responsive to the people, that is accessible, and that will point this city in the direction where every single resident can thrive.
People from different cultures, different races, with a vision that we would be the city, and we will be still, where everyone, no matter where you come from, no matter how rich, no matter how poor, everyone has an opportunity and a chance to make something of themselves.
That's Toni Harp, incumbent mayor, who was beat by Justin Elicker last night. Still unclear, Colin, if she's going to move ahead and challenge him in November. We were a bit surprised last night. Now that you've had some time to digest all this, still really surprised?
By the margin, yeah. I mean, sort of going into this, people who really follow New Haven politics pretty closely, people who participate in New Haven politics, they were kind of uncertain about this. I mean, there was sort of a sense that, probably Harp was going to win, but nobody was ruling out an Elicker victory going into yesterday. Now, I don't think anybody thought he would win by 2,000 votes. I mean, that's a lot. And in terms of what she's going to do, I'm 90% certain she's all done. She will sit today, tomorrow, however long it takes, with getting the advice of people she trusts, looking for a path to victory in November. But if there isn't one, there's a sting for somebody like Toni Harp, who has not lost an election before, to lose by 2,000 votes in a primary she probably should have won, is very, very painful. And she would not want to go into November and lose even more badly. That would compound the misery she's in right now. So, and basically the problem is that the unaffiliated voters who would vote in November would seem, based on history, to belong more to Elicker than to her. That would probably increase his margin rather than decrease it. So she'll talk to anybody that she trusts in the next day or two, but I just don't see a path for her. And if she doesn't see a path for her, she's not going to do it.
Kalila, how surprised were you?
I was very surprised by the margins, at the very least, as Colin said. But I think the tension in the city has been palpable for quite some time. I always tell my students that everything is political. And so over the last 2 weeks, many parents have been upset about changing bus routes and blaming the mayor and blaming the superintendent for not doing more to keep kids safe. So I think that activated a group of voters who said enough. And the changing demographics in New Haven, like a number of other cities, what does it mean that people have started moving back into the city and occupying new spaces of power and new spaces of resources? I don't think very many people expected this win at the primary level. I think people thought maybe there's a better shot at the general election of ousting an incumbent. But to do so in the primary and to do so decisively in a city that is really a union and labor-backed place, that says a lot about the path to victory for November.
Kalila, how much do you think that this was about Justin Elicker, the candidate, a new vision for the city of New Haven? Or, as you and I think a lot of people have suggested, was it about a mayor who increasingly people found ineffective or maybe not taking care of the issues that they care about most?
I think this was more a referendum on Toni Harp as mayor. I was watching the returns come in for each ward last night, I began thinking about Joe Lieberman running against Ned Lamont some years ago, right? Well, people didn't really know a lot about Ned Lamont. They couldn't really tell you what his vision was or what his platform would be, but they knew they wanted something different, and they wanted to send a message that politics as usual is not working in the city. And it's really been a cluster of challenges around schools, around policing, around public safety, around projects that people expected to move, that they said, this is the person that we're going to hold accountable, and this is what we want to see a change in.
It's interesting, Kevin, that Kalila brings up Ned Lamont and Joe Lieberman because famously Ned Lamont beat Joe Lieberman in that primary. And then as they headed toward the general election, many people found that that version of Ned Lamont didn't really have a whole lot to say beyond the things that he'd said to get him to that primary moment. And then it was hard for him to win in November. I don't know if Justin Elicker faces the same sort of challenge in November, but maybe faces a challenge in terms of what to do with the city of New Haven.
Well, in 2006, it was Republicans who put Ned Lamont Joe Lieberman over the line in the general election.
Absolutely.
A huge majority of Republicans voted for him. And that won't be happening in New Haven because there aren't any Republicans. But so I think
it's
you're right.
Car full.
I don't think that Toni Harp has a place to go to try to tap into new supporters. This was her truly her base of supporters. Maybe not her maximum number, but pretty close to it in a general election. And some of those Democrats who voted for her in a primary will vote for Justin Elicker in the general election. I think ideologically, they're pretty close, and so that I think there's a sense of administrative competence that helped Justin Elicker because the Harp administration has had some real problems lately, and for community people, some of those were cumulative, but in the sense of outsiders watching, some of it seemed new, but many people were not surprised at all that's been going on within the administration.
There are a lot of things, Colin, that happens at the mayoral level in cities like this, and administrative competence, as Kevin puts them, is one of the most important things, right? The idea of just making the city work. It's not always what people show up to the polls for. Sometimes it's about personalities. Sometimes it's about getting state money in or who knows who. But sometimes it's just literally about how well does my town work.
Yeah, and I will say this, a couple of things about that. First of all, being a mayor is different from being a member of Congress. People tend to hate Congress but love their congressman. No matter how much they hate Congress, they like John Larson or Joe Courtney or whoever. But if you don't like the way your city's being run, or if you think things are not right, then you hate the mayor too. So, you tend to own problems more if you're the mayor. But I would also say that for this to happen, you really need at least two things. You need people to be dissatisfied with the mayor, and they also have to believe in the alternative. You could argue that Hartford's got a lot of problems right now, some problems that are pretty similar to New Haven. You could argue that Hartford's got worse problems than New Haven. But Luke Bronin wasn't facing anybody that I think people were prepared to invest their hopes in. I think the things that hurt Harp the most, the 11% tax increase the year before. They'd have these horrible fast-twitch 2-year cycles in New Haven. But she sort of inflicted the pain the year before the election and then tried to finance her way out of budget increases in the second year. People didn't like the tax increase. People are upset about the schools and stuff like that. It does hurt you, but it doesn't ultimately hurt you unless there's somebody who can come forward and persuade everybody that he or she is a better alternative. And I think, Elicker ran a very, very strong, very vigorous, very visible campaign. And that's some of what caused last night.
Kalila, I know you follow this more closely than any of us, certainly. What do you see as moving forward for Justin Elicker? These next couple of years, it seems likely, as Colin said, that we're not going to see a challenge from Toni Harp in November. He's going to have, as he said, perhaps a stronger mandate than he might have because of the margin of victory to lead New Haven. So what's next for Justin Elicker? What does he have to fix right away?
I think that he is going to face an uphill battle leading this city. New Haven has often felt like the tale of two cities. You see tremendous growth in certain parts of the city and others where people are struggling to find access to jobs, access to public transportation, quality education for their children. So he will inherit all of that angst that people feel. And like Colin said, running a city, people want to see an immediate impact of what you are going to do in that office. I think day one, he has to consider how to bridge those divides. There are people who say, we don't know him. We don't know what he will do. We don't yet know what his governance style will be. And he will face that backlash from every sector of the city to lead through those divisions and really do something to show people why New Haven is a great city.
If we're talking about divisions between different neighborhoods, talking about perhaps a downtown that's doing well and neighborhoods that aren't doing so well, Hartford is certainly a city that comes to mind. It's been like that for quite some time. Luke Bronin, the incumbent mayor, beat Eddie Perez and Brandon McGee last night. Let's hear from them right now as we turn our attention to Hartford.
We may have some differences, but we all love the city of Hartford. And I hope that after tonight we can come together and keep building a stronger and stronger Hartford.
I pledge to continue to work in Hartford on the critical issues of education and neighborhood development. All our neighborhoods cannot succeed unless our kids are given a quality education and our residents can grow wealth within their neighborhoods, each and every neighborhood.
So that's Eddie Perez, the former mayor, and Luke Bronin, the current mayor, and now seemingly the mayor once again for another term. Kevin, a very different story than what we saw in New Haven. It's a 55 to 32% margin. Bronin over Perez. Brandon McGee of 12%. He didn't show very well. What did you see out of this Hartford race last night?
I see that $1 million buys you about 55% of the vote in a Hartford Democratic mayoral primary. That's about what he got 4 years ago, also with a big money advantage, though not nearly as big an advantage as he had this year. And that bigger gap in money it makes a huge difference. And the other thing is, of course, Eddie Perez didn't run a very good campaign, and his conviction for corruption is a stumbling block for many voters.
It's not a stumbling block for all voters.
No,
because,
but for many voters.
For many voters it is. But let's just pull apart the $1 million, though. It's not always reflexive anymore in politics that the $1 million buys you anything, but you think in this particular case it does.
Well, you have a very small universe of voters. And so, per vote, it's going to be a staggering amount of money per vote.
Colin?
I don't really buy the money argument. I mean, obviously, Luke Bronin had a lot of money. I don't know how much good money does you in a municipal campaign if you're only going to spend it legally anyway. So, and I mean, I think probably the more dispositive element here was Luke Bronin still enjoys the backing of what amounts to the party machine. So Mark DeBella, who's the Democratic chairman, backs Luke. He and the town committee are able to keep people like Ed Vargas and Cal Torres, who are Latino politicians, on the Bronin farm. And meanwhile, Brandon McGee was backed by Minnie Gonzalez, another very influential in her small universe Latino politician, which means that Eddie Perez, who really needed probably something pretty close to 100% of the Latino vote to even be close to viable, was in fact having to share it with two other rivals. To me, that's the biggest thing, the fact that he still kind of has the machine backing. And Eddie's a deeply flawed candidate. One thing about Brandon McGee, people should not count this young man out. I think, he didn't run the greatest campaign right now. I talked to somebody yesterday who knows him pretty well, and he just says he's also just got a lot on his plate. He's a legislator. He has another job besides that. I think he's got a young kid. He's the kind of guy who goes to church 2 or 3 times a week. He may not have been perfectly poised to get in early and pile up endorsements the way you need to if you're a challenger. But that doesn't mean he's not going to do something down the road. He may. He's a young guy. This is kind of the learning curve moment for him. He may do something later.
Kalila, what did you see in Hart? Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Well, I was just going to say,
yep.
Money is especially powerful in these campaigns when your opponents don't have any.
Right. That's really true.
I think,
and Eddie is really out of money right now. There's talk, will he go forward to November? Well, he can't go forward to November with no money. Yeah, I don't know what $1 million does for you, but no money is not good.
Kalila?
Yeah, I think there's a broader story here about the role of money in politics, not just for candidates, but for those who want to exert their influence. And at the very base level, those who see public office as an outlet for them. For McGee to say, I'm going to run to be mayor of my hometown, understanding that I am a working legislator who is supporting a family, but I want to be the voice of people who say I don't even have the money to clear the entry point to pursue public service. What does that mean that that has become the standard for who we think is viable and eligible to run? Hartford is a very diverse city, but I think the context of Hartford is so different from what we see in places like New Haven and Bridgeport. Bronin had a tough time when he came into office in terms of the fiscal health of Hartford. And I think this is a place where having the machine back you worked for him, and having that immediate name recognition without the baggage, the sort of personal baggage of a Perez, helped him in this case.
Kalila, Colin pulled apart some of the factions in Hartford, something we've talked about for quite some time. The Latino population, whether or not that they would get behind Eddie Perez, who they obviously have supported in the past. Brandon McGee, an African-American man from the North End, as you say, somebody who is a working legislator who's trying to rally support. I'm wondering how much you see in this Hartford race, and certainly in the New Haven race that you follow so closely, how much you see race playing a part.
I think race is central when you're talking about local politics, because in a place like Connecticut, it is hard to disentangle race from place in terms of where people live, how they live, where they work, and the interactions that they have with other groups, particularly in Hartford, where you have such tremendous diversity within those communities, the thriving West Indian population within Hartford. And so the sort of historical tensions or distances that have existed between people who have West Indian heritage and those who have their families migrated from the southern U.S. and settled in Hartford. That means something for the networks that exist, for a candidate to navigate those networks and be able to be present and seen as a viable person that community can trust. That also varies based on country of origin. So to talk about Hartford, not just in terms of the Black vote or the Latino vote, but to see how class and immigration status operate within those communities too.
I think that's a really, really great analysis. I think also one distinction, I'm trying to think of a way to frame this so that it's not an offensive statement, but there's a way in which the New Haven has sort of a different composition these days from Hartford, right? So there's, obviously in each case there's a relatively affluent, mostly white group that's isolated in one or two neighborhoods. But I think the kind of growth that New Haven experienced, particularly under DeStefano, has also created some expectations. There's now kind of a white middle to upper middle class, Kalila, correct me if I'm wrong about this, who maybe their expectations are a little bit different. Maybe what they think they deserve because of entitlement and privilege is a little higher in terms of schools and stuff like that. I wonder if that is part of Elicker's margin last night, that there's sort of a group of people who live in New Haven and they want it to be the kind of place that they're comfortable living in, with the kind of schools that they're comfortable sending their kids to. Maybe they're also the kind of people who are not quite at the level where they can send their kids to the private schools too. They want public schools that they feel okay about.
I think that's very accurate for New Haven. You had, white flight happening in that area where people had abandoned the central city. If you look at the demographics of New Haven in terms of growth in Latino population, and you look at the school population, it is overwhelmingly students of color within public schools. in New Haven. And so now that you have middle-class white families who are either returning to the city or staying in the city, the demands are quite different. If you listen to the sort of signaling that happened amongst a number of Elicker supporters during this race, right? We want the mayor to be more accessible. We need a more open door policy with the mayor or with the superintendent, which generally means if I call you, I expect a call right back. If I make a demand on you, I expect you to respond to that. And that is a level of access and privilege that we don't always have the same expectation of people in office who look like us or who come from our residential neighborhood.
Kevin, I want to ask one last question on this because you raised money, and Kalila, I think, pulled this apart very well. If the price of 55% is $1 million, and if a Luke Bronin is going to be the type of person to get that $1 million, what sort of problem does that set up for the city? I mean, are we looking at a permanent situation in which a white candidate from the outside who is very wired up in the Democratic Party and in state government is going to be able to succeed in a way that the Brandon McGee's or, let's say, a slightly less flawed Eddie Perez would be able to? Maybe that's just the permanent state of politics in Hartford for a while.
Well, Luke Bronin's not from Hartford. He's from Greenwich.
Exactly.
And he had access to donors that other candidates, whatever their race, are unlikely to have. And he's going to try not to serve out this term in all 4 years because he wants to run for higher office. And we all know that. And he will turn his fundraising.
It didn't work great for him.
No,
last
it's terrible. Time. It was. I don't think he learned anything from it, but yes, it was sort of an embarrassment. And but I think he'll probably try again. Note that no statewide Democratic office holders endorsed him in the primary, and yet. Because they see him as a potential competitor, and I don't think anyone would have been too sorry if he had gotten a lower percentage of the vote.
Talking about people who decided to run for governor and it didn't go so well, we're going to turn after our break to Joe Ganim, who seems to have won re-election in Bridgeport. We're going to come back and talk more about that race. And when we come back, we're also going to be looking ahead to Thursday night's presidential debate. A whole lot of Democrats on stage, 10 of them. It's not as many as we've had in the past. It could be the next, thinning of the herd of the Democratic presidential candidates coming up. We're talking with Kevin Rennie, Kalila Brown-Dean, and Colin McEnroe here in the Wheelhouse. We'll be right back. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky, talking about the week's news with Kalila Brown-Dean, Associate Professor of Political Science at Quinnipiac University. She's the author of a new book, which is out next week, Identity Politics in the United States. We're going to be talking about that with her in just a moment. Kevin Rennie is an attorney, a Hartford Courant columnist. He also blogs at dailyructions.com. And, of course, I'm joined by Colin McEnroe, the host of WNPR's Colin McEnroe Show. What's on the show today, Colin?
We're doing a show about panic attacks. I shouldn't be laughing because panic attacks are no joke for the people who get them.
Just sounds about right for today.
Right. It does sort of fit somehow. I could say more, but I think we have other things.
We do have other things. Oh, I thought you were going to elaborate.
I could elaborate, but
okay, you're not going to.
I will say that on the show today, there are some people who are very familiar to regular listeners of the show, guests who are familiar in other contexts to regular listeners of the show. You might be surprised to find out that they have panic attacks.
Very interesting. So that's the Colin McEnroe Show today at 1 o'clock. We're going to finish up looking at the big city races that we were covering last night. And by the way, if you go to our Facebook page, you can see our coverage from last night. Colin, myself, Lucy Nalpathanchel, and a whole team of reporters covering things like Joe Ganim narrowly beating Marilyn Moore. Before we pull this apart, let's hear from Joe Ganim and Marilyn Moore.
The challenges that face our city and cities like us are difficult. Progress sometimes is slow, but when we come together as a city that says, we are a great city and we will work to make our city better.
You know, there are going to be people sitting back talking about we lost, but we didn't lose. Because the people who voted at the ballot on the machines, those people, we won. And we have to know that that is just the first step in showing people what's possible.
So that's State Senator Marilyn Moore, who narrowly lost to incumbent Mayor Joe Ganim. Kalila, what she's talking about there is, in a little bit of a surprise, Marilyn Moore beat Joe Ganim at the polls yesterday. Not too handily, but at least by a substantial margin. But she lost very substantially in the absentee ballots that were counted by about some 600 absentee ballots. I think Joe Ganim had 900 to her 300. And so she's saying, I turned out people yesterday. Is she right about that? She didn't exactly lose yesterday.
I think that this is really a story of what happens when you stay on message and you work your strategy. Marilyn Moore was not expected to win at the polls yesterday. I think all of the commentary from Ganim surrogates accusing her of not being representative of the community, saying that she was not the candidate that people knew. The fact that she was able to win at the polls says a lot about Bridgeport, about changes in Bridgeport, and about people's confidence and maybe in some ways disgust at how that race turned. I think it's also going to raise broader questions about the rules of the game. I expect people to be, contacting the Secretary of State to say what happened with absentee ballots, what are the rules for that, and how is it being enforced. I don't think that Ganim should take this as a mandate at all because, given his profile, given sort of his connection to Bridgeport and his key surrogates, I think they expected to have a much more decisive win yesterday.
Another rule that is a little bit different is that you can have now in Connecticut Election Day registration for general elections, not for primaries though, so you can't just show up at the polls and say, I want to vote today for Marilyn Moore or Joe Ganim, so those rules are a little bit different. So, Kevin, I don't know. One thing that we obsess about in the media is, Joe Ganim did spend some time in prison for his past misdeeds. It's the sort of thing that we tend to care a lot about. Maybe the people of Bridgeport don't care so much about. What did you see out of this race yesterday?
Well, the first thing I think is important to note is that absentee ballots count just the same as the
Absolutely.
ones that are cast on Election Day. And we're in a state where a lot of Democrats in particular are talking about having early voting. And to somehow cast doubt on these absentee ballots, it seems to me to be really disingenuous.
It is Bridgeport.
It is Bridgeport, but I don't. There are no allegations
yes.
that someone was, in the back room of in City Hall, filling out absentee ballots. The Bridgeport and Hartford and many other communities, the political organizations have very vigorous absentee ballot programs, and they work them. And his people obviously worked it. He probably had more troops on the ground and was able to. He had the organization behind him. They're very good at absentee ballots. It was harder for Marilyn Moore. She had a tremendous showing. Absolutely. Maybe she expected this. I hope the candidate did, but others didn't, and she certainly has put a big scare into him. And if she can get on the ballot in November,
she can.
She's got the momentum.
And I think we determined, Colin, that she can't. As of last night, I think that there's an appeal perhaps to the Secretary of State's office, but as of yesterday, we heard that she did not qualify to get on the ballot in November.
Right, and the Secretary is pretty emphatic about that. I mean, the thumping sound you hear is me pounding my head against the wall because I really do think. I mean, we have to say, just as Kevin just said, this is a really big surprise, and there's an opacity to Bridgeport politics if you don't live there and work there, and if you're not Lenny Grimaldi or Brian Lockhart. It makes it hard to understand from the outside what's going on. I certainly had no idea. I thought this was a layup for Ganim, and I said so. So, I mean, this is a big surprise. And so she did this hard thing. She beat Joe Ganim on the machines, on the voting machines. That's a huge thing. She loses on the absentee ballots, as Kevin says. Not a big surprise. The reason I'm pounding my head against the wall, she needed 207 signatures to get on the November ballot. Because of the way that it works in Connecticut, and I haven't really looked at it for this specific thing, but it's often easier to get on the election ballot, the general election ballot, than it is to get on the primary ballot. The election ballot, the number is always pegged. I think it's 1% of the total votes cast in the previous analogous election, something like that. So she needed 207 votes. And so the only thing she can do at this point, and the Working Families Party may do this, is examine the process by which signatures were disqualified. They can ask for that. They can ask for some transparency about that. That's going to happen at the City Hall level, not at the Secretary of State's office. They are, I believe, not the ones who disqualify. I think that happens. These whole things kind of get run at the city level. But, it really, having done such an amazing thing yesterday, to beat Joe Ganim on the machine votes, and then just kind of through sloppiness or just under, if she had just collected one signature for the general election for every signature she needed to be on the ballot yesterday, she'd be in great shape. Just have 2 pieces of paper there, and she'd be in fine shape. She'd be running in November.
Kalila, just very quickly, I'll ask the political science professor. Spinning this forward, what Kevin was talking about, new ways of voting in the future, different people thinking about ways in which we can open elections up to more people, maybe even primary elections. How do you see those sorts of changes, those sorts of ideas changing the type of city politics that we have today, in which literally a get-out-the-vote campaign sometimes means driving people to the polls, absentee ballots means going out and collecting them? Does some of this need to change, or how will politics change if we make new rules?
I am all for expanding access to democracy, particularly in local elections that can have an impact on people's everyday lives. The caution that I always offer is how enhancing that access, how often you have to pound the pavement to get votes, will that affect the role of money in politics? Will it become more expensive to run a campaign because now you have to do these sort of, souls to the polls efforts for a longer duration? You have to reach more people because now more people are eligible or at least have access to that voting process. So I think we should always keep that in mind, whether it's enhancing publicly funded campaigns or creating pipelines for people, underrepresented, underserved communities to be able to run for and hold public office.
Okay, so we're going to turn from municipal elections all the way up to this presidential race. And on Thursday night, there's the next presidential debate amongst people who are vying for the Democratic nomination. We have 10 candidates on stage, which sounds like an awful lot, but it's a lot fewer than the 2 different debates with 10 people each. And this is a smaller group of people, Colin. It's the top contenders. You've ranked them kind of, a top few, and then the next tier, and then a following tier. I guess the big question, first of all, is what do you expect to happen on stage Thursday night that's different than what we've seen in previous debates?
Well, one thing that'll be different would be Warren and Biden on the same stage. And I think it has to be also noted, I don't think that anybody really thought Elizabeth Warren, say 6 months ago, was going to do what she did, right? Everybody always knew that, she's very, you did? Okay, Kevin's raising his hand.
Kevin is raising his hand, folks.
But for her to go from being acknowledged as a very sort of smart policy-driven candidate, but who didn't necessarily win the hearts of voters in quite the same way, to the kind of candidate who does win the hearts of voters. She is very competitive right now. And in the Q poll that dropped today, which is a Texas-only Q poll, people like her ideas, I think, 2-1 over the next best person in that poll. They like Biden's electability 5-1 over the next best person in that poll. But so I think that's one of the more interesting things is what else can Warren do? What happens when she's on stage with Biden? But yeah, it's Biden, Bernie, and Warren, and then there's sort of a second tier that's really Mayor Pete and Kamala Harris. They're the ones in kind of fatter single digits, and then everybody else is a low single digit candidate. And some of them need to hang around because what happens if Biden implodes? Then you need maybe a Klobuchar, maybe a Booker, somebody like that who's centrist. Beto would be another one who's probably hanging around for that reason. You need somebody to kind of take over that centrist, not too far to the left role that Biden occupies, to almost the exclusion of everybody else.
Kevin, I want to turn to you next, but first explain why you were raising your hand before.
I thought that there's a real opening for Elizabeth Warren with her reputation for having plans for everything and being sort of brainy. And I think there's
people associate her as the ideas candidate.
They do.
Yeah.
Many of them terrible ideas, and I think that will become a problem. For instance, why should 2/3 of the people who don't have college educations pay off the loans of the 1/3 who do? And I think that's going to be. I think that when it's dissected, and we'll see if some of that starts in this debate. I do think she's going to have some explaining to do.
So she's going to have explaining to do. What about Joe Biden? He's going to have some explaining to do. He's just not explained himself very well so far in these debates.
That's true. I imagine
that's my analysis.
I imagine they're working him. They've got a murder board working him pretty hard, and they'll have to have, as they all do, but they'll have to have some notable pat lines to get some favorable attention from this debate, because in the end, often what the story becomes is someone who's got a zinger.
Oh, God, Kalila. And Kevin's probably right about that, right? It's going to come down to who gets the biggest zinger. And meanwhile, you've got Elizabeth Warren, who has so many ideas that she wants to talk about. It would take up the whole 3 hours of the debate. So what do you see happening tomorrow night?
Right. I mean, it's the Tulsi Gabbard effect, right? If you can get a good zinger or a good one-liner, somehow you think you are entitled to surge more in the rankings. Look, I think the context matters here. The fact that this debate is happening on the campus of Texas Southern University, which is a large, public, historically Black university. All of these candidates have talked about their plans for making higher education more affordable. Can they condense in a few words or into a soundbite how they are going to address getting kids to college? Being able to see education, public education, not just higher education, as a way to build the economy of this country, to create our own workforce, and to serve the public good that comes with education. So I think every candidate on that stage tomorrow night will have some explaining to do, some more so than others. So Cory Booker will have to answer the critique about charter schools and those networks that we've seen really cozy up to the Trump administration. How will these candidates do that? And you can't do it in a 5-minute speech. You really can't do it in an extensive policy platform. People want to know, make me interested in learning more about you as a candidate.
Kalila, can I just ask you about that middle tier of candidates that Colin talked about, Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris? Kamala Harris surged after taking on Joe Biden in an earlier debate, and then she has seen her numbers fall. Mayor Pete had a big surge early on and has sort of been in the middle. What do you expect from these two people who are playing maybe a different game than the Andrew Yangs of the world right now?
I think public speaking and oratorical skills matter on a debate stage when you have to cut through such a large and crowded field. And I think both, Senator Harris and Mayor Pete have shown their ability to hold their own and their ability to do that, to command an audience, to be able to capitalize on their opponent's stumbles and mistakes. And I think that is something that we will see tomorrow night. I'm sure they're all being prepped to do that. And the surge that we see in campaign donations after their performances will really give an indication that we can't just think about the primary. We also have to look at the signaling that's happening for people who will vote in a general election next November.
Yeah, I think Harris has these rhetorical skills that make her very good at debates. The question is she good at other stuff? So she got a big surge, and then she had what an internal document from her own campaign refers to as a summer slump. She had a terrible August in terms of polling and money. And the problem with that is that can start a whirlpool effect. Your poll numbers sink lower. It makes it harder for you to raise money, which makes it harder for you to get on the air or get the visibility you need to make your poll numbers go up. So she's in a little bit of that vortex right now. A debate is something that can help her get out of it. Joe Biden is not a good debater. We should say that. In fact, I don't even know what Joe Biden is good at except at being Joe Biden. That's like the only thing that he's really good at. But, this is a guy who I don't think he really did all that well in 2008 against Sarah Palin, who, went in there not able to name 5 letters of the alphabet. But they got her ready. They taught her how to pivot. I actually don't think that he's a particularly good debater. This is not where he shines. I guess he kind of shines a little bit on that kind of retail politics level or something. I don't understand it. Like, Kevin, why does this guy have the numbers? Why does he have 40% of the black vote? I don't get this.
Well, he's been around a long time. He's known. He's been everywhere. As vice president, you do get to make a lot of friends.
Yeah.
And I think he's associated with Barack Obama, who's phenomenally popular.
Kalila, how far does that take you? Being associated as the meme with Barack Obama as his best buddy.
I think that's done. I mean, people know at this point that you were vice president to Barack Obama. We've all seen the memes. We've all seen that. People need to know what more do you offer than just being the president's or the former president's BFF. And that appeals when you're doing a very direct sort of boutique style approach to politics. That works when you're going to rallies or to smaller gatherings. But on the national debate stage, right, we are now 3 years past a Barack Obama presidency. What is Joe Biden's vision for this country? And that vision has to be greater than I am not Trump or I am Obama's friend. It has to be concrete. What are you doing today that may have not been the same political environment in 2008 and 2012 when you ran before?
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about two very interesting political ads with Kalila Brown-Dean from Quinnipiac University, Kevin Rennie from DailyRuctions.com and the Hartford Courant, and our own Colin McEnroe. This is The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news with Colin McEnroe, with Kevin Rennie, and with Kalila Brown-Dean. She's the author of a new book, which is out next week, called Identity Politics in the United States. Kalila, can you tell us about this book?
Sure. I'm so excited. So I think that the term identity politics has become very pejorative in our country. And often people use that phrase when they want to bemoan others and how they organize around their interests. And what I argue in this book is that all politics in the U.S. is about identity, whether that is our identity as people of Connecticut, as U.S. citizens or not, as, members of a particular spiritual tradition. And what I trace is how identity politics has developed over time and really what we can do to move toward a more perfect union.
And again, that's a new book coming out from Kalila Brown-Dean next week, Identity Politics in the United States. We're excited to take a look at the book and excited to talk more with Kalila about that coming up. There's always at least one ad in every political cycle that people just buzz about and that is a lot of fun to look at. And we're going to play a little bit of audio from the one that we're talking about right now.
I was an undercover CIA operative. My assignment was preventing rogue states and terrorists from getting nuclear weapons. You name a hotspot, I lived it. Then Dick Cheney's chief of staff took revenge against my husband and leaked my identity. His name, Scooter Libby. Guess who pardoned him last year?
Yeah, and as you hear that line, guess who pardoned him last year? You see a picture of Donald Trump. This, Colin, is a really compelling ad from Valerie Plame. Yes, that Valerie Plame. And she's driving a car across the New Mexico desert. I guess she's running in New Mexico, so people here in Connecticut can't vote for her. But judging by some of the reaction you got to posting this, a lot of people in Connecticut seem to want to.
Yeah, so, this ad, it really looks like a movie trailer, like a really good movie trailer, too. It's a very, very Hollywood ad, and it's done very well. And, they are also helped by the fact that Valerie Plame is very photogenic. I was kind of surprised because I put it up on Facebook and just, I think they're like the shares may have gone up over 100 or something. And people were liking it and commenting and saying that they were finding ways to donate to her campaign. And at a certain point, I jumped onto the thread and I said, look, this is an ad. It is supposed to make you feel things and not think so much. That's what advertising typically does. So you should know something other than what's in this ad before you make a campaign contribution or anything. And Kevin, I'm sure, would like to introduce at least one aspect of Valerie Plame that doesn't necessarily fit the narrative of this ad.
Two.
Okay.
The first one is Scooter Libby may have done bad things. He did not leak her name. Richard Armitage, who was the Deputy Secretary of State to Colin Powell, leaked her name to Robert Novak, who had a column at the time. And that's where there were references to it. And it wasn't Scooter Libby. I guess Scooter Libby makes a better commercial, but that's not who leaked her name. And the second is, she's tweeted some anti-Semitic screeds, and eventually she said she hadn't read what she had tweeted, but not before she said, well, the neoconservatives, they're mostly Jews, and tried to get away with it with that.
So Colin was hearing a lot of positives. Kevin not loving this ad so much. What do you see, Kalila?
Well, I think the ad did exactly what she wanted it to do. It got people talking about her. And, I'm sure if we looked at Google searches after that ad came out, you would see this dramatic increase. It reminded me a lot of when Joni Ernst first ran back in 2015. And she had this ad where, she bragged about being a veteran, about castrating hogs for a living, and then you hear this sort of horrible squeal of a pig in the background. Right? People were so shocked by that, the visual of it and the sound of it, that they wanted to know, who is this candidate? And the same thing, I think, is happening here. Doesn't mean that people will start flooding her with donations and votes. No, but it was extremely effective. And whoever created the ad, I'm sure will get a bonus.
I want to play briefly another ad that I know you've been talking about with students, Kalila. And this is an ad about gun violence, and it features almost all of the people that you'll see in the Democratic primary debate tomorrow night.
Gun violence is literally life and death.
That has become so numbingly common
that we have kids going to school wondering if they're going to be physically safe.
Learning about how to duck, cover, hide.
For fear that there is a mass shooter roaming the hallways of their school.
That's wrong. That shouldn't happen in a country like ours.
That's a tragic reality that exists today.
And it's deep. It's serious, and it's wrong what's going on.
Kalila, what do you see in this ad? It seems to show unity amongst these people who are fighting it out on many other fronts against Donald Trump.
I think it shows that as a nation, we should have a common interest in addressing the scourge of gun violence, not just when it takes place in a mass shooting event in a Walmart or outside of a nightclub, but the sort of everyday banal acts of violence that don't always make the news. I think everyone that you saw in that video has had to address it from their perspective, whether as a mayor of a city or as a prosecutor or as a member of Congress, figuring out what we do. My students watched the video. They were moved by it, but they immediately said, what about? So what about Andrew Yang? Why is he not in that video? Has the party decided who its top tier will be or who is most likely to have to take on these issues if they continue to progress in office? But I can't imagine seeing a video like that happen at another point in our country where people were willing to say, yes, we're running against each other, but what we are all united in is this need to protect our common humanity and at the very base level, our safety.
The one thing that I would say is that I think guns remain an incredibly powerful issue. If it's used correctly by the Democrats, they can win elections. There's a way to frame it that works. I actually think that it affected the 2018 election in Connecticut more than people think. But I mean, parents all over America send their kids to school every day, and they're scared. They're scared in a way that my parents didn't have to be scared.
Kevin, a quick thought?
I don't think they say what exactly they want to do, though. They're alarmed by gun violence, as certainly all of us are. But then what are you going to do? I'm not sure that background checks is going to be the only answer. As a legislator, I voted with the majority of legislators to ban assault weapons in Connecticut. Hardly any of them are talking about that. Mm-hmm. And look at background checks. A lot of these people who engage in these violent acts, they'll slip through background checks.
I think the important thing here is background checks, the most popular bipartisan measure amongst all Democrats and Republicans. Kalila, we're running short on time very quickly. You have something that you want to crow about or something you want to grumble about?
I just want to say my feat of strength this week is to the people of the Bahamas who are not only fighting these really devastating aftermaths of the storm, but also exposing the cracks in U.S. policy toward helping people in need.
Kalila, thank you for that. Kevin, how about you?
Well, I would like to salute two publications. First, the She Said book about Me Too movement by the two New York Times reporters. And also, I want to say Dave Altamari of The Current is doing a tremendous job on the disappearance of Jennifer Dulos.
I think that we can all agree about that. Thank you for that. Colin?
My feat of strength, it's the best time of year to be outside in Connecticut, I think. And I have a recently replaced knee, but I'm excited because I can actually walk on the beautiful trails in Connecticut. So my feat of strength is to the Connecticut Forest and Park Association and everybody else who helps maintain these trails. Wherever it is that you live in Connecticut, you're, maybe a 10-minute drive at most from a really beautiful walk. So in this great weather, get out and walk those trails.
I will just endorse that. Thank you very much. Let's get outside and walk a little bit. I want to thank Katie Solarski, who produced this week's episode, and Kyone Wolf, our technical producer. Thanks so much to Colin McEnroe, host of The Colin McEnroe Show, Kevin Rennie, a Hartford Current columnist, a blogger at dailyructions.com, and Kalila Brown-Dean, associate professor of political science at Quinnipiac University. Thanks to Jonathan McNichol for engineering down there. This is The Wheelhouse.